these classes, and they will be put up on our on-demand website. So if you miss part of it or you miss a class, you can go and watch those. It will probably take a few weeks for us to get all of those up because it's some technology involved. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Josh Goodman from the Florida State Archives. And he is going to give us our class for these 4 weeks. He's a wonderful presenter. If everybody else could mute themselves, that would be great. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Josh. So you will be the host, and you will have to admit anybody else that shows up in the waiting room and also end the class. So thank you so much, Josh, for doing this. And you are now the host.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Maureen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Good. All right, excellent. Let's see, we've got some, oh, and just as soon as you pop that over, it looks like we've got some folks wanting to come into the room. So welcome to all of you. What I'd like to ask everybody to do is to, during the course of the presentation, if you would, just so that we don't have the background noise, if you would keep yourself muted. And it tends to, if you have a question, the best way to share it with me is to use the chat function. You can actually type messages into a chat window that will reach me. I have it open right here on my second screen. The way that you can get to that is on your panel there where it says share screen, participants, mute, stop video, that sort of thing. You should also see something that says chat, or you may see a little thing that says 3 dots, and it'll have 3 dots there and say more, and then chat is the first thing that you see on the menu. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and type a message right now just so that you'll see it. And then when you go to find chat on there, you should see where I've put a message that just says chat. So what I'll do is stop periodically and answer any questions that arise during the course of the program. We'll also have some time at the end of the program where we'll unmute everybody, and or everybody will have the opportunity to unmute themselves and ask questions verbally so that we can have a more organic discussion. But yes, during the course of the presentation, if you would type those questions in so that we can kind of keep things flowing, and we'll just stop in between sections to answer questions as we go. We've got a lot of exciting material today over the next 4 weeks. I'm really looking forward to sharing this information with all of you. Florida, as you know, is a state and an area of North America that has gone through tremendous change during the entire history of its existence, and certainly very much so since the Europeans got here a few centuries ago. And the State Archives of Florida, of course, our documentation of that sort of drops off as you get back towards the colonial era. But we do have some wonderful pieces that go back into that time period. And the closer we get to our modern era, there'll be more and more things that not only can we talk about them using this exciting medium of web chatting or webcasting, as it were, but there are also things that we have right there at the State Archives that are ready for you to view. I understand, just looking in here, I see some familiar faces, some familiar names, but I also see some individuals who I have not encountered before in doing lunch and learn programs and lifelong learning programs before. So I should probably say a little bit about the State Archives and who I am and what we do and why you should care. First off, my role at the State Archives is as the staff historian. So we have lots of archivists who spend a lot of time taking in new collections, looking at existing collections, getting them into a system of organization so that folks can find what they need and pull them off the shelf and use them. My job at the archives is primarily to look at what we have and try to make connections between the collections and different groups that may be interested in using them. People like teachers and students, or genealogists, or community historians who are building exhibits and doing histories and, you know, getting ready to celebrate the anniversary of their town or something like that. And I also do a good bit of promotion by writing materials and giving presentations like the one we're having there. There is a common misconception about archives, and that is that the state archives of Florida, because it's got the word state in there, that it must be some very top secret type stuff that you got to have special permission to use, or that you need to have a letter of introduction or something like that. And nothing could be further than the truth. We are a public institution, and even in these crazy times, we are still serving the public every day. We get email and phone requests for research all the time, and even though our reading room is not quite open just yet, we still are able to serve folks through those methods. And in fact, we have at the end of the presentation some contact information. So if you are interested in something that you read about, or if you've got questions about other records that we might have, land records, business records, different things that you might want to know about Florida, we'll have that contact information ready for you. But we do have a reading room, just like almost like any public library that you would encounter. The only difference is that rather than dealing with published materials, books and DVDs and things like that that a library might have, we're going to have unpublished materials, things like diaries and letters and manuscript maps that were hand-drawn, and government reports and memoranda and things like that, that there are only one copy of around the world in most cases. So that's kind of the big difference there. But we are a public institution. We are definitely open for research. But that's enough sort of shaking the tree to get business for the state archives. Let's talk a little bit about the subject of our program over the next 4 weeks. Florida at the crossroads of empire, dating all the way back to 1513. Now, Florida is widely known as, we think of it, or at least I like to think of it, as a sunny paradise, good for vacationing, good for maybe finding a nice place to retire, or a place to have a second home, great place to raise a family and enjoy the good life. That's what Florida's good for. But there was definitely a time prior to the United States ownership of Florida when it was a little more dramatic, a little bit more of an international borderland, and not always a peaceful one. And you know, Florida has been inhabited now for, as a matter of fact, they're kind of changing the clock on that. It's been about 14,000 years, give or take. And for a good bit of that time, of course, it was just Native Americans who were here. But once the Europeans get into the Western Hemisphere, and Columbus and some other individuals, we've got another person to admit here, welcome. So once we start getting the Europeans over here in the 15th century, then things start to change, especially, you know, at first, Spain kind of has the monopoly on exploration in the Western Hemisphere, at least this part of it. But then as the French start to get a little curious, and the British start to get a little curious, and even the Dutch start getting over here and start sort of sizing up the North American continent, then it starts to get a little crowded over here very quickly, even with this large expanse of land, as these imperial powers start jockeying for position. You know, they start making these voyages to the west, ironically, to get to the east. Columbus, of course, his famous purpose for coming this direction and running into Hispaniola is so that he can, you know, try and find a way to get over to what he called the West Indies, or you know, try to get to the Indies so that he can establish a trade route by sea that doesn't involve having to go around the tip of Africa and go through all of the vulnerabilities associated with such a long sea voyage. But and of course the other European nations are interested in this as well. And that's what's fueling all of this interest in finding a northwest passage of some sort to get over into the Pacific, or you know, trying to find something to the south as well. So they're looking for trade routes. They're, you know, looking to, once it's determined that there is a pretty sizable continent here, as well as a lot of Caribbean islands and that sort of thing, then people are looking for you know, places to establish lucrative colonies. And then you know, once multiple empires are starting to sort of elbow up against each other, another objective becomes, all right, well, we're not exactly the best of friends here in Europe. How can we position ourselves in the Western Hemisphere so that back in Europe we're not losing ground in our effort to sort of stay ahead in the great European game of empires? So Florida is sort of thrust into the middle of all of this just as soon as it's discovered, because it does occupy a very strategic location in all of this. I'd like to stop for just a moment. Can everybody see the map here from 1763? I want to make sure everybody's following along with the presentation. Are we all seeing?
Yes.
Yes.
Mhm.
Very good.
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna grab my pointer real quick here and make a little pin. And then here we go. All right, so if we look at where Florida is located right here, and this map is a little bit anachronistic. We're not going to get to 1763 today. We're really only going to get to essentially really the latter part of the 16th century. But I like this map because it gives you a sense of how much is going on, by the time all of the European empires are sort of getting involved in this business of settling North America. We've got New France up here, and then they've settled Canada here, and they're also starting to claim Louisiana and all of this territory down in here. The Spanish, of course, they're kind of first on the scene as far as the Europeans are concerned, and they established a lot of colonies here in the Caribbean, and then, of course, New Spain here in Mexico, and then they developed this whole other province up here in New Mexico and get Florida going. We've got the Portuguese hanging out down here in Brazil, where we can't quite see it on the map here. You've also got the Dutch kind of poking around up here in what we now call the sort of the northeastern part of the Atlantic seaboard. So there's a lot going on here, but Florida is strategically located. Here we go. We've got another person in a minute. Welcome to Donna. But your
sound is cutting in and out.
Right here. I'm sorry? Okay.
Your sound is cutting in and out.
Okay. With Florida being located right here, as it is sort of in the midst of all of this. Now, of course, right now, Spain is still in all of these, with all these colonies here. There's not really any other European countries that are occupying any other islands at this point, and that we're going to be talking about today in the 15th and 16th centuries. But Florida commands a very important sea route going back and forth between Spain over here across the Atlantic and all of these different ports in New Spain, where they are mining things like silver, they're finding some gold, there's a few different stones and minerals and things that they're transporting. And very quickly, the Spanish explorers and the Spanish merchants are learning to use this trade route that involves the Bahama Channel right here. And Florida, even though it takes a while to kind of get a permanent settlement in Florida, the Bahama Channel proves to be very important for keeping an eye on that, and it becomes very important for Spain to not have anybody else occupying that area. So even if Florida itself does not yield up the gold and the silver and the jewels and all those things, it's a very important strategic location, and that's going to drive a lot of the history that we talk about today in all of this. Okay, so let's go ahead and bump over to the first thing. So the first part of our program today I'm calling Terra Incognita, because Florida is part of a very large expanse of North America that is completely unknown, or at the very least only rumored to exist, for many of the key players who will be involved in actually settling Florida, or attempting to settle Florida, or at least explore it. So that's the theme of today. Now, we tend to think of Juan Ponce de Leon as being the first guy to kind of show up in Florida. We credit him with discovering Florida. And that's most historians do use 1513 as the date that Europeans first make really good established contact with Florida. But there is evidence that there may have been some European contact even before that. What you're looking at here is the Alberto Contino Planisphere, which comes out in 1502. It's originally, it goes to Portugal, but it's also copied and put into Italian records as well. And you can see over here, let me get my pointer back. You can see that it's based on information that's coming from Portuguese explorers who had figured out that South America was over here. You can kind of see the outlines of Brazil and what would now be modern-day Guyana up here. And you can see that they had determined the Antilles, the location of the Antilles, and they've got, this would be the island of Hispaniola here with Haiti and what's now the Dominican Republic. And then this would be Cuba right here. And then you can see that they've got this other thing right here that they don't really, they don't really give a whole lot of information to. But again, a lot of map making at this time and a lot of explanations about what exactly had been discovered. A lot of these locations are sort of based on assumptions and cobbling together of sort of the written notes of a lot of these explorers. And some historians do believe that the explorers who had explored up to the 1502 mark, that they had actually seen Florida, and that's what that they're actually looking at here. That's not conclusively proven. That it could have been that John Cabot or Cabot, depending on how you pronounce it, from the British, that either he or his son Sebastian, both of whom explored under the British flag, they may have seen Florida and sort of passed that information along to the folks who put the Planisphere together. There could have been other Portuguese explorers who looked in this area and realized that there was a large landmass north of Cuba, but we don't know that for sure. But we do start seeing Florida or something very Florida-like appearing on maps as early as 1502. So let's go on to the next slide here. But Juan Ponce de Leon is generally thought of as the first guy to kind of make contact with Florida and to quote unquote discover it, at least as far as the Europeans are concerned. Of course, we know that Native Americans were here for thousands of years before Europeans ever even knew about the place. But we do give Ponce de Leon credit for kind of being the first European guy to set foot here and really give the place a name. So a little bit about Juan Ponce de Leon. He's born in 1474. He comes to the Western Hemisphere for the first time with Christopher Columbus on Christopher Columbus's second voyage, which is in 1493. And the purpose of that voyage is to try and actually establish a colony. First time you bring a voyage over here, yeah, you might try and leave it here somewhere, but you're really focusing on trying to just explore. So this second voyage, however, they're thinking, all right, we've got some chances to do something really good with this land. So let's bring some people over. Let's bring some livestock.
Other teacher, Maureen.
Let's bring some food and that sort of stuff. If you're just joining us, if you would, do mute yourself. That way we don't get any of the background noise. And then if you have questions, we can use the chat panel over here, which is available on your main panel there for the Zoom conversation. So we get Juan Ponce de Leon over in 1493 for his first expedition with Columbus. He got some experience helping Columbus subdue the natives on the island of Hispaniola and the surrounding area. But like any young guy, he was wanting to, because he's only in his 20s at this point when he comes over for the first time. And so he wants to make a mark of his own. And so in 1508, he went to Puerto Rico and explored the island. People had rumored that there was a big island up there that had some mountains and, looked like it would be a really great place to explore, possibly have some minerals, but nobody knew that for sure. So here goes Juan Ponce de Leon to go and try and do something with the island of Puerto Rico. The Spanish king turned around and made him the first governor of Puerto Rico. He built a town, made some inroads with the local natives, probably by force, a good bit of that. But he ran into some politics in Puerto Rico. Diego Columbus, who was Christopher Columbus's son, unseated him as governor. I mean, after all, his dad was the one who kind of discovered this whole sort of region for Spain. So he did have some cachet. And you see that happen sometimes with some of these islands in the Caribbean as these explorers are sort of jockeying for their own personal position. So Diego Columbus unseats Juan Ponce de Leon as governor of Puerto Rico. So Ponce is looking around for a new project. So in 1512, the Spanish king at that time, Ferdinand II, actually gives Ponce de Leon letters patent, they called it, to go and locate and govern the Islands of Bimini. And these were islands that were rumored to exist north of Puerto Rico. At this time, they don't know that Florida exists. They hadn't really discovered the North American continent, John Cabot and his son Sebastian, they knew that the North American continent was there, but that news hadn't really trickled down. Nobody in the Spanish orbit had really confirmed this just yet. So they send Juan Ponce up there trying to find these fabled islands of Bimini, hoping that there might be some riches up there, or at the very least, some Native Americans who they could sort of bend to the Spanish conquistadors' will, so to speak. So March 4th, 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon gets together a small expedition, and he starts setting out to the north to go and try and find these islands. But instead of ending up in Bimini, he actually discovers Florida instead. He also discovers the Bahama Channel and the Gulf Stream at the same time, which ends up being a major boon. So even though he doesn't end up finding any gold on this particular expedition, it's huge for Spain because it helps Spain get the gold and silver and other minerals and other riches that they are pumping out of their South and Central American colonies. It gives them sort of a fast track to get back over to Spain over in Europe, because the Bahama Channel there uses the power of the Gulf Stream to just sort of jet you out into the Atlantic. And if you're in a ship that does not have a steam engine in it, you know, if you're relying strictly on the winds and the currents to carry you, that's pretty important. So even though Juan Ponce doesn't exactly find any gold in Florida, he still finds something very, very important. So yeah, March 27th of 1513 is when he first sights Florida. He thinks it's an island at this point, so that's kind of interesting. He ends up landing on it in April, and he decides to name the place La Florida. And that's because it's named after Pascua, Florida, which is an Easter celebration, the Festival of Flowers, the Feast of Flowers, rather, at that time. And so that's how Florida gets its name. No attempt is made at this point to really colonize. He does get out somewhere along the area of the Atlantic coast, somewhere around Cape Canaveral. It could have been as far north as St. Augustine. Some historians have even said he may have been up there around the mouth of the St. John's. There's all kinds of different formulas that you can use to try to figure out exactly where Juan Ponce landed. But suffice it to say, it was on our Atlantic seaboard, and that's why we call it the first coast, because it's the first coast that the Spanish actually make established documented contact with. So he finds the Native Americans fairly hostile, so he doesn't spend a whole lot of time on the Florida littoral at that point. He gets back in his ship and decides to use the rest of his food and supplies and time to explore, to try and find the dimensions of this island that he's discovered, which he is soon to discover it is not an island, but more on that later. While he's sort of rounding going around Florida here, let's see if I can get my next slide up. There we go. All right, so Juan Ponce lands somewhere in here for his initial sort of claiming of Florida for the Spanish crown. But after making contact with the natives in this area, by the way, this map is from the 1580s, so all of these named places that you see on here, Juan Ponce would not have known these names. He would not have even discovered these rivers that are being identified here. But this is just to give you a sense of kind of what what the Spanish explorers think Florida looks like in the 16th century. So after he gets done sort of having his initial moment of having discovered Florida here on the first coast, he decides to sail around and try to find the boundaries of this thing. Just how big is this new land that he's discovered and that the Spanish crown is giving him the right to settle and govern? And in the process, he names a few things that we're familiar with. For example, he discovers the Florida Keys. He realizes that there's this little archipelago hanging off of the bottom of what he still thinks is a very big island. And he gives those keys the name the Martyrs. He names them after the martyrs. And so he also discovers off a little bit to the west of the last key that he encounters. He encounters a whole different set of islands, and they look like little turtles coming up out of the ground because they're very low and some of them are very round shaped. And so he calls them the Tortugas, which translates roughly to tortoises in Spanish. And so he has a chance to kind of look around in this area, may have gotten as far north as Tampa Bay, may have only gotten to Charlotte Harbor, But anyway, he doesn't make any attempt to colonize at this point, and so he heads on back to Puerto Rico, and then ends up going back to Spain not too long after that to make a report of his 1513 expedition. So the Spanish king at that point, Ferdinand II, is pretty pleased with Ponce's progress. This is looking like some place that they might be able to do something with. It's pretty big. Weather's pretty good. They might be able to grow something. They might be able to find some precious minerals or something in there. And they definitely know that there's some Native Americans there for the Franciscans to go and attempt to convert, that sort of thing, that whole God, gold, and glory sort of thing. Oh, admitting Sonia to the room. Welcome, Sonia. The king, Ferdinand II, he decides to extend Ponce's patent and to make him governor over these exact lands. The patent had to be changed up a little bit because this is not Bimini. It doesn't really look anything like what people think that Bimini was supposed to be. And so this is something totally different. So the king says, all right, you've discovered this place, you've given it the name La Florida. I'm now going to make you what's called the adelantado, or sort of the guy who, the governor with the, I'm trying to think of a good way to translate it. It's kind of like the governor, the first governor, the guy who's going to be the one to kind of make the settlement really happen. Like an introductory governor, we might say. That might be a good way to translate it. So Ferdinand II gives this job to Ponce and says, all right, now you can go back and try to establish a colony, and you can try to go back and explore some more. But first, here's the catch. The king needed Ponce to get involved in some other business elsewhere in the Caribbean because as the Spanish were trying to expand their hold on the Caribbean islands, as you can imagine, the Caribs, the Native Americans who were living in that area were not exactly willing to just bend over backwards and help the Spanish, do their conquest, so to speak. And so the Spanish felt that they needed to be subjugated. So Ponce was involved with that for a few years. And so it's almost a decade before he gets a chance to go back to Florida. He finally goes in 1521. In 1521, Ponce leaves out with 2 ships, 200 colonists, 50 horses, and livestock and farm tools. And he reaches the Gulf Coast somewhere in the neighborhood of Charlotte Harbor. For example, this little piece right here, the bay up underneath the Bahia de Espírito Santo, which is the name for Tampa Bay at that time. But you'll see this other little harbor just to the south, which is supposed to represent Charlotte Harbor. They've called that Juan de Ponce. And so the generally accepted explanation is that this must have been where Juan Ponce de Leon landed. It was in the vicinity of Charlotte Harbor. Unfortunately, the Native Americans that he encountered on this coast were no different than the ones that he had run into when he was over on the first coast. And so as the Spanish are sort of trying to make their way onshore and to try and establish some kind of modus vivendi with these Native Americans, the deal turns kind of sour and they attack. And the Native Americans who are there actually shoot Juan Ponce de Leon with an arrow, and the colonists decide that they need to cut their losses and go rather than risk complete annihilation. And so they end up leaving a lot of their cattle and a lot of their supplies. In fact, this is thought to be how cracker cattle gets established in Florida, that original scrub cattle species that for so many centuries ran wild in Florida was because of this very incident that Juan Ponce has all these cows that he just essentially has to leave here because he's wounded and a bunch of other people are wounded and killed, and they've got to get back to base, so to speak. So the expedition leaves and takes Juan Ponce de Leon back to Puerto Rico, and he ends up dying there. And he's actually buried in San Juan, in the Cathedral of San Juan Bautista. That's his tomb. I've had the pleasure of going here once before. It's a really interesting church. If you ever get a chance to go to Puerto Rico, it's a great place to go. So there's that. So Ponce de Leon passes away. No permanent settlement is achieved. During the course of that, it is attempted, but unfortunately, nothing comes of it. So who's our next guy? Who's going to be the lucky next contestant on the game of who's going to get to settle Florida? Well, the next guy to try it is a dude named Panfilo Narvaez. King Charles V, Ferdinand II dies in the period in between the time that Ponce tries his attempt and the time that Narvaez goes. And the new guy is King Charles V, who also happens to be the Holy Roman Emperor at this time. And he grants Narvaez the title of Adelantado and gives him the mission of exploring and colonizing Florida. So in 1527, an expedition leaves from Spain and heads over to Florida. The idea is that the ships would resupply in Cuba and then land in Florida. But then, of course, as always happens in these days, when they don't have a good understanding of the weather, a couple of storms hit, the ships get scattered. So this expedition is already off to a pretty bad start by the time they get over to the New World. But they do finally get some of their ships back together, and Narvaez makes a landing on April 4th of 1528 in the neighborhood of Tampa Bay. It's not exactly certain where in Tampa Bay they landed, but based on the way they describe it, the people who chronicled this expedition, it looks like it was somewhere in the vicinity of Tampa Bay. They go in, they make contact with the natives. They're a little smarter this time. They bring some gifts. They bring some little trinkets and different things and food and different kinds of products that they think the Native Americans might accept. And they do manage to get a reasonably good reception. And so they're able to find out from doing some communication with these natives that there is a land to the north called Appalachia. We all know the name Appalachia, don't we? We've got a parkway named after that. But he hears about this famous land of Appalachia that's got all of these things that Spanish conquistadors love, particularly gold. Whether the natives had ever actually seen gold or not, it's hard to say. They might have been pulling Narvaez's leg. I don't know about you. I've never seen any gold around Tallahassee aside from, what was brought in from other places. But suffice it to say, they told Narvaez what he really wanted to hear. So he gets started on his expedition into Florida. He makes a little deal with his supply ships and says, look, guys, we're going to go over land. I want you guys to meet me up. We're going to sail north. So, we're going to go north over land. We want you guys to sail north. And so we'll be able to rendezvous with you and get some supplies. Famous last words. So what ends up happening is Narvaez and the little overland expedition, they go over to the interior. Let's move back to our map here. This is kind of where they land, right in the vicinity of Tampa Bay, which at that time is still being called the Bahia de Espiritu Santo. And they go over here to what is called the Ocala territory. Ocala, does that sound similar to anything we might know? Maybe Ocala? That's exactly the case. Ocala is named after this early Timucuan territory that's known as Ocala. And so they come over here. They don't really find the reception that they were looking for. The natives are a little hostile, and they don't find any gold. They don't find anything worth sticking around for. And so they start heading north to this fabled land of Appalachia. The only problem with that, we don't exactly know where Narvaez went. Some people think that he went along the coast to try and stay close to his supply ships and to try and find them. We do know that he sent some reconnaissance missions to go and try and see if they could sight these ships, but we don't exactly know how much of the expedition went along with that. What we do know is that they got to Appalachia at some point because they crossed the Osceola River, which was the traditional boundary between the Timucuans and the Appalachians at that time. So they do make it across the boundary into Appalachia territory, into the vicinity of Tallahassee. And historians do believe that they spent some time down at St. Mark's trying to make some sort of contact with their ships. But they never quite are able to do that. And that becomes a big problem because Florida ends up not having sufficient game and sufficient resources to support the expedition as big as it was. And so that they run into some problems with that. They start thinking it might be time to kind of evacuate Florida and get back over to Mexico or Havana. And so while they're in the vicinity of St. Mark's, the Narvaez expedition actually ends up building some makeshift boats trying to get back over to either Mexico or Havana. And so they get on these boats, they abandon Florida essentially, and start heading west, trying to get to Mexico. And of course, again, as always seems to happen, they ended up, their boats ended up being destroyed in a storm. And they have a few survivors, about 70 survivors after the first storm, but then they end up stranded on an island for a while. They meet up with some natives that end up killing some more. To make a long story short, by the time you get to 1536, which is, gosh, that's 8 years after this expedition starts, 4 survivors finally make it back to Mexico City, one of whom thankfully had kept a diary of what was going on. And so he was able to describe this. So 4 survivors out of this make it back, and Narvaez's expedition essentially comes to nothing. Then comes a guy that we're a little bit more familiar with, maybe, Hernando Desoto. He gets a similar assignment from his king to explore and conquer Florida and look for potential riches, that sort of thing. And he makes a similar landing on the 30th of May, 1539. So we just celebrated last week the anniversary of DeSoto's arrival in Tampa Bay here. And he kind of makes the same kind of jaunt that Narvaez does. He speaks with the natives in this area, and they tell him about the fabled land of Appalachia, and he's thinking, this sounds pretty good. And so he starts beating a track up towards Appalachian territory. At some point, we do know that he crosses the Swanee River, that he crosses the Wasilla River. Where exactly he crosses is a little bit difficult to determine. There are all kinds of archaeological and historical theories about how exactly that took place. But we do know that DeSoto spent the winter of 1539 in the Tallahassee area. In fact, we can actually get it down to almost an exact spot because archaeological evidence has revealed that he spent the winter just off of Appalachian Parkway near where the Governor Martin House is, because when they were doing some excavations in that area for a new housing development, they discovered shards. The state, it's a great story. The state archaeologist, Calvin Jones, I think was it at that time, he actually was on his lunch break and just, archaeologists, they can't pass fresh dirt without digging in it or without looking in it. It's a funny thing about archaeologists. And anyway, so he goes over to this construction site and he asked the guys if they would mind if he went through and looked in some of the stuff. And they said, sure, why not? We're on our lunch break too, why not? So Calvin Jones starts looking around in all this stuff, and he starts finding these little shards of pottery and pieces of olive jars and things like this. And to make a long story short, they end up doing this tremendous archaeological investigation right there at what is now the site of the Martin House, and they were able to determine by triangulating between the evidence they had and the written chronicles of the DeSoto expedition, and they were able to determine that this was actually the site of the village of Anhaica, or just outside of it, and this was where DeSoto and his men were able to spend the winter of 1539. So after they get finished spending the winter there, which, by the way, it's not a peaceful thing. Anything you see about first Christmas celebrated in North America by Europeans, do keep in mind that they were still in a constant battle at this point with the Appalachians who were ensconced there at Anhaica. It was not a peaceful Christmas. So there's that. But anyway, DeSoto leaves Anhaica after the winter of 1539 and spends some time traveling all around the southeastern United States. And eventually, he passes away while his expedition is close to the Mississippi River. He is reputed to have been buried in the river, so possibly just sort of weighted down in the river or sent off to, like a funeral pyre or something, floated off. Different accounts sort of describe this different ways. But he does die in the vicinity of the Mississippi River. Out of that entire expedition, which eventually ends up going back to New Spain, back to Mexico, no permanent settlements are established. So we've had Ponce de Leon, we've had Narvaez, we've had Hernando Desoto, and still no permanent settlements out of all of this. What's it going to take for the Spanish to be able to actually establish someplace permanent to try and get this very heavily strategic location? What's it going to take to get it settled? so you know, because it doesn't have any gold, or it doesn't appear to have gold, doesn't, you know, the natives are hostile. There don't appear to be any other major selling points. I mean, I guess they could sell crushed mosquitoes or something like that, but the Spanish are starting to lose hope of this piece of land being anything good. But here's the funny thing. Despite the fact that Florida is proving to be such a disappointment as New World territories go, the Spanish are unable to abandon it. And the reason for that is because of that strategic importance of Florida. Again, if you look over here on kind of the big map here, it's got this part that says Canal de Bahama, the Bahama Channel. By now, Spanish ships, fleets, the plate fleets, or, you know, there's different names for it, but the fleets of ships that are carrying things from all over Central and South America and all these Spanish possessions, they're all starting to use the Bahama Channel to get that boost, to go on across the Atlantic Ocean so that they can get those fleets back over to Europe very quickly. And so because of that, they can't abandon Florida, because it's not so much that the Spanish really want it, it's just that they don't want it falling into anybody else's hands. So for that reason, by about 1558, Spain decides, well, okay, if we're not going to colonize Florida per se, let's at least establish some kind of military outpost. Let's at least get something, so that, you know, so that other countries are not going to be able to get a toehold in this new, really weird continent that we've discovered that we didn't think was here in the first place. And so we get this guy. Spain decides that there's two different points. Let me jump back to the map real quick. So there's two key points that Spain decides that it wants to fortify. There's the Bay of Ochuzi, which they've got on this map. It's kind of, this map is kind of funny, because they've got the Ochuzi over here. They've got it way upriver, up this Rio de Flores, which, you know, different historians say different things about what all these rivers are supposed to be. Some people say this is supposed to be the Mississippi. Some people say that this is Mobile Bay and that this is the Mobile River, different things. But suffice it to say that by the time Pensacola by the time a settlement is attempted in Pensacola in 1558, Ochuzi is the name of the bay that Pensacola would be on. So that's sort of a target for the Spanish to try and establish some kind of something there. And then the other place that they're thinking might be a good place to establish some sort of fortification is over here in Santa Lena, on what is now, we would call that Port Royal over in South Carolina. And so the Spanish are thinking, well, we need to establish, you know, a nice Gulf Coast port of operations and one on the Atlantic seaboard as well. And so the guy they think is going to be the person to do it is this dude right here, Tristan de Luna y Arellano, which this is a highly stylized sketch. This is not what he looked like. This is what the State Chamber of Commerce came up with in the 1950s when they were getting ready to celebrate the quadricentennial of Tristan de Luna's expedition. So Tristan de Luna gets the job from the Viceroy of Mexico. His name was Luis de Velasco. And Tristan de Luna gets the job of making sure that these points get some garrisons set up, some little mini military groups here. And so this expedition starts out in 1558, and it sets out. Interestingly, it's almost exactly where we are now. We're just a week shy of the anniversary of the expedition setting out, because they set out on June the 11th of 1558. Now, what are we thinking about right now that's in the news that might prove somewhat troublesome to somebody who's doing some marine exploration? Hurricane season. So not to give too much away, but that's going to prove somewhat difficult for Tristan de Luna. So it's a little dangerous. So the plan for the de Luna expedition was to establish a settlement at the Bay of Ochuzi, and then to send a group overland to go and establish something over here at Santa Elena. So to establish something over here, wherever, again, this map is somewhat inaccurate. So wherever Pensacola is in this area, the Bay of Ochuzi, that is the bay that they wanted to do their first settlement, and then send some guys overland, maybe make some buddies and some allies in here with some natives potentially, set up a secondary settlement. All right, problem. The first group of Tristan da Luna's expedition sets out. They get to Achuzi on August 14th of 1558. But then in September 19th, 1558, a huge storm comes up, most likely a hurricane, and destroys part of the fleet and many of the expedition's supplies. So kind of just like Narvaez losing his ships because of a big storm that he encountered on the way to Florida, this dude's already behind the 8 ball before he's even had a chance to build his first, hut or something like that. The expedition unravels pretty quickly from here. They do establish a settlement here, an actual what would have been the beginnings of the first permanent settlement in Florida, and therefore the first Spanish one in what is now the United States. And Pensacola loves to tell this to St. Augustine. They like to say, look, St. Augustine, you might be the first permanent settlement that actually makes it, but the first time the Spanish actually built buildings and really established something permanent is actually over here in Pensacola. So it's a little bit of a war between those two cities. There we go. We've got Josephine in the room. Welcome. So they do get something established, but unfortunately they don't have a lot of supplies, and they're trying to live off the land as best as possible. But within a few months, the expedition has eaten all of the plant-based food that they know about. They're having trouble finding enough to meet the needs that they have of the expedition. And so De Luna ends up making the somewhat risky decision of trying to move inland to try and to either find some food supplies belonging to the Native Americans that they could commandeer, or try and find some other more favorable place to establish a settlement that could produce food. That ends up being a kind of a big problem. They do run into some Native Americans, but they are able to get a supply of corn that they commandeer from Native Americans inland from Pensacola, heading towards what they called Coosa, which of course is in Alabama and Tennessee. That's the name associated with those areas. But the no such settlement is going to be big enough to sort of handle the needs of this expedition. And so people start to doubt Tristan da Luna's ability to lead this expedition, which leads to some pretty dramatic things where he kind of beseeches God for assistance for all of this, and asks for the expedition's forgiveness for his for his shortcomings in leading the whole thing. It's a whole deal. But suffice it to say, they end up abandoning the settlement at the Bay of Achuzi, and as well as the settlement farther inland. And so the expedition ends up going back to Mexico pretty much empty-handed. So Pensacola, the upshot of all this is Pensacola does have the first settlement, but not so much the first permanent settlement, because it does fall out. We won't see Pensacola settled again until you and I get back together next week when there's a threat from the west that needs to be. And that's when Pensacola will finally get resettled later on in 17th century. So what's it going to finally take to get Florida, a permanent Spanish colony? We've now had 4 different explorers who have tried and failed to make this happen. Would you believe that religion actually ends up having a role in getting Florida finally settled, finally pushing Spain over the edge and saying, all right, come hell or high water, we're going to really get a settlement put in here. So up until now, I think I've got a map for this. Let's see what I've got in the way of maps. Oh, good. Oh, no, let me not tip my hand there. So up until now, the threat from other European empires had been pretty much an abstract threat. Yes, John Cabot and his son Sebastian, or Cabot, or however you like to pronounce it, they were poking around in upper North America, discovering Canada and all this sort of thing. And yes, you've got a couple of French explorers who have sent some expeditions over to North America. But up until now, there had never really been any activity down in the latitudes where the Spanish explorers had been attempting to deal with La Florida. And I should mention that at this time, if you look at the small map over here, the kind of zoomed out map, what they are calling La Florida right now, thanks to the Desoto expedition, all of this all the way up until you get over to Mexico and New Spain, all of this is being called La Florida at this point. And we'll see some maps next week where this is actually borne out in the maps, where Spain is actually claiming all of this, and it's calling the whole thing Florida. And right now, none of the French or British explorers are really threatening any of that. And so, the threat of that's all pretty abstract at this point. But it's about to get not abstract, so to speak. And that's because Spain's exploration in the New World. First of all, before we go any further, we've gone a good long ways without asking for questions. Anybody have any questions about what we've talked about so far? I think we kind of got use your chat panel to ask questions if you have it. Certainly glad to answer any at this point. I don't see any questions popping up right now. If I see some come up and we've got a moment, then I'll certainly. Oh, how's Ochuzi spelled? So I'm going to spell that back out. And it's done a couple of different ways. If you look on the map here, you see that they've spelled it with an A here, which means that, and that tells you a little bit about how it would have been pronounced, because unlike English, where an E can mean 10 different sounds and an O can mean 10 different sounds, the Spanish, Latin-based languages tend to use only one sound per vowel, and the A means ah. It almost always means ah. So since they've spelled Achuzi here with an A at the beginning, that means that they would have pronounced it Achuzi or something like that, because an I always means the sound E. So you could, the way that we normally see it is this, O-C-H-U-S-E. That's the way that it appears in most maps once it's a pretty established bay. But as you can see in these early ones, even as late as the 1580s, sometimes they're using different spellings. It also depends what language the map is being written in. The British, again, English is not a Latin descended language, and so it's going to have different pronunciations, different vowels, different vowel sounds. So, but the one that I put in there, O-C-H-U-S-E, is going to be the most common spelling. That's the way it's usually spelled now when you see it mentioned in more recent histories of Spanish exploration. Let's see. All right, books that cover this material. Best book that I can recommend. Do I have it handy? Oh, shoot. I have like my favorite book in the world on this topic. When we get to the end of this, if somebody would remind me, I don't want it to stop right now just because I'll have to hunt for it, but there is a book, it's called just America. It's written by a British historian who does an amazing job charting not just the history of Spanish exploration in Florida, but all of the North American continent, all the way over to California and even into the Oregon Territory. It's just an amazing book, and I recommend that pretty heavily. Let's see, what other thing we have? View is blocked at the top of your map. Spanish were not great fishermen. Can't believe they're starving, given the bountiful coastline of Florida. It's a question of volume. That's a good point. There's plenty of fish to be had in this area, but it's a question of whether they have the capacity and enough people to actually produce enough food for all of the people who are on this expedition. Remember, we're talking about hundreds of individuals who are striking out and moving around in areas that don't necessarily have a permanent establishment. They're not necessarily staying in one place long enough to grow a crop. And even if they do, they're facing disruptions from the natives at this time. So there's a lot of factors sort of going into this issue of them not having enough food. Juan Ponce de Leon's search for the Fountain of Youth. Is it fake history? The Fountain of Youth is a common story at that time. Certainly, it's kind of like El Dorado. Lots of explorers talked about this. There's a little bit of mysticism that goes into it. Remember that these are deeply religious individuals who already have a pretty strong belief in sort of exterior forces beyond what they can see and touch and feel in the world. So, how much stock Juan Ponce de Leon put into the existence of the Fountain of Youth is not particularly easy to determine. That is not the primary reason that he comes to Florida. He's given the opportunity to govern and essentially own the land that he comes over to. So the Fountain of Youth, of course, no doubt the people who are on these expeditions are aware of it and certainly would have been very interested to see it. but there's a lot of more earthly, more synthetic interests involved, I think, than just the fountain. But it certainly makes for a very good story, and certainly sold some great, made some great tourist attractions. One that still exists over in St. Augustine. Yes, and the Narvaez Expedition Diary. Don't buy it. It's true you can buy published editions of it, but that should be available in several different formats on Half the Trust or Google Books. It's because that's all that was written and translated many times over in several different languages, and that's all. None of that's in copyright anymore, so you should be able to get that for free. I wouldn't pay for it unless you really want to have the book to hold in hand, but you can get it for free through Google Books or Half the Trust or some other supplier like that. And if you're interested in doing that, in fact, I think UF Digital Collections even has an edition of it. I can help you put your hands on a free edition of that, as well as the Chronicles of the DeSoto Expedition as well, if you're interested. Okay, so let's go ahead and move into our next phase here. These are all great questions. Please do keep those coming as we go. But let's go ahead, just so that we stay on time here, and jump into the next bit. So let's see, so Spain's exploits did not really happen in a vacuum. Other European countries knew that Spain was having success with these explorations. And so, even in the age before internet and radio and television and things like that, news is still traveling pretty fast, because all of these things are being reported at royal courts, right? And then, these courts have ambassadors from all the different countries who are in that area, and they're hearing this now very public knowledge that, say, Columbus and John Cabot and all these people, have made these discoveries, and they take this information back to their home countries, and that starts the wheels turning, the geopolitical wheels turning about, well, okay, if Spain is finding all of these areas over in the New World, they can claim whatever they want, but how right is it really for us to be left out of that? Do we maybe want to stake a claim for some of that? There's some risk involved with that, because if you find something totally new, there's this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery, where if you find something new and you literally put a monument of some sort and you declare it, that other countries are supposed to kind of respect that. But at the same time, we see throughout world history that countries, if they decide that they rightfully deserve a piece of a new piece of territory, that they can take it. You run the risk of going to war with that country, of course, but hey, sometimes you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. So this is how that kind of plays out. In 1493, Columbus comes back from his first expedition. He tells everybody about what he found in the New World. Okay, Spain and Portugal immediately start clashing over whether Spain or Portugal had a right to claim those lands. The reason for that is because the Pope, remember both of these are Catholic countries, so the Pope had already established some rules to kind of govern who could take what in Africa, because prior to Columbus going across the Atlantic and ending up in the Americas, the bulk of the age of discovery, the bulk of the discoveries had been kind of along different parts of Africa, rounding the Cape, heading over into the Indian Ocean, that sort of thing. So Pope Alexander VI decides to step in with a papal decree kind of settling all of this. And he grants Spain, he puts out this document called the Inter Caetera. Inter Caetera, that's I-N-T-E-R, and then the second word is C-A-E-T-E-R-A, Inter Caetera. And he essentially says, all right, Spain, you guys get everything that is west of a meridian line 300 miles west of the Azores. And of course, they wouldn't have used miles at that time. They used leagues in describing that. But let's see, I think I've got a little, there we go. I've got a little graphic here that sort of describes this. Now, the Inter Caetera, that line was not where, that line would have been about right here where I'm drawing the line right now. Just barely getting the tip of Bruce. Okay? Again, here's the Azores right here. That's the basis for this meridian. Meridians are up and down lines. And so the idea is that the Inca Terra says, Spain, you get everything that's over here to the west. Portugal, you get everything over here to the east, because they had already pretty much made a pretty big toehold in Africa, and they wanted to keep that. So the Portuguese king, he sets up a whole different dispute, because he says, look, okay, I see the Inca Terra, but I'm supposed to be getting everything that's south of the Cape Verde Islands. So how are you going to, doesn't that mean that I should get all this stuff over here too? Even though it's west of the Inca Terra line. And so Spain and Portugal, since the Pope says, look, I've already ruled on this, I'm kind of done with this dispute. So Spain and Portugal actually make a treaty between each other called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And this is concluded in 1494. And what it does is it takes the Inca Terra line and it moves it to the west a little bit, to 370 leagues west of the Azores, and it runs right down what's now the middle of Brazil. And so it essentially says, Spain, you get everything to the west of that line. Portugal, you get everything to the east of that line. Fun fact, that's why in Brazil, they're surrounded by British-speaking countries. But in Brazil, the official language is Portuguese, not Spanish, because the bulk of Brazil, certainly all of it that's on the Atlantic coast there, is actually in Portuguese territory, according to the Treaty of Tordesillas. All right. Some other kingdoms are also taking note at this time as well, as we go here. 1496, King Henry VII, that's King Henry VIII's dead, gives John Cabot, or John Cabot, however you like to pronounce it, letters patent to go and discover lands in North America. And Cabot ends up coming across, he comes over into this area and discovers lands in Canada in 1497. In 1524, you got another guy named Giovanni de Verrazzano, who is an Italian dude, if you didn't get that from the name. He's from Florence, and he's actually sponsored by France, who explores the Atlantic coast of North America from Florida all the way up to New Brunswick. So we got Britain kind of exploring up here. We got the French doing some exploration along the coast of North America here. And then in 1534, you got another guy who, and this creates a little bit of a headache for France and England. You got Jacques Cartier, who explores the Gulf of St. Lawrence up here and actually claims Canada for France. So we got two different people, who are claiming Canada at this time. That's going to become a bit of a problem. It's not something we have to worry about talking about Florida, but just goes to show you all of these countries are sort of jockeying for position at this point, which is going to become something of an issue. Okay, and so this kicks off an ugly Anglo-French contest. But so by the middle of the 1500s, all of these major European powers are starting to sniff around in the New World for territory. And then in 1536, the worst possible thing happens as far as Spain is concerned. In 1563, sorry, I think I said 1536 earlier. 1563, the Spanish King Philip II finds out that there are Frenchmen who are trying to establish a colony. In fact, they had established a colony in Spanish-claimed Florida on the Atlantic seaboard, down in this area right in here. And not just any Frenchmen, Huguenots, Protestants, Lutherans. Now remember that Spain is devoutly Catholic at this time, devoutly Catholic. These are the same people who brought you the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, so it's pretty serious that there's Lutherans in here on their flank. Okay, a ship and the reason that they found this out, they had some interesting intelligence. There was a ship sailing in English waters that had rescued some Frenchmen in a makeshift boat who had abandoned their post at Charlesfort up here at what's now Port Royal in South Carolina. And they had abandoned their post there, and they got picked up in English waters. And so, of course, news of that got all over Europe, and that kind of gave the jig up, so to speak. And then also a Spanish naval vessel picked up some French pirates who claimed to be Catholic refugees from a French outpost called Fort Caroline. And they claimed that it was under the control of some Protestants over there, and that they had disagreed with the Protestants, and that's why we left. I have a suspicion that some of those Catholic pirates were probably Protestants as well, but we don't know that for sure. So this is a really big problem for Spain because there's twofold. There's two issues. Not only is this a foreign power that is establishing a toehold in the vicinity of the Bahama Channel, thereby putting a potential strategic chokehold on the Bahama Channel, but in addition to that, they're Huguenots. So anytime that they spend with the Native Americans in the area talking about their religion, that's all going to be problematic when the Spanish go in there and start trying to convert some of the natives, trying to convert them to Christianity, which makes it a little easier for the Indians to sort of be manipulated into the Spanish civil system of sort of governance. It's going to make it a lot harder if, you know, those Native Americans are already believing Protestant principles. So this is a pretty big emergency. So just a little quick bit of story on the Huguenots. I want to make sure we've got plenty of time to get everything in here. But just a quick story on the Huguenots and why this is so important. The Protestant Reformation, of course, gets kicked off in 1517 with Martin Luther putting his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Church, and sort of the beginning of the Protestant Reformation here. That kicks off religious conflicts all over Europe, okay, including in France. French Protestants are generally known as Huguenots at this time, and they cleave towards the Calvinist tradition of Protestantism. There's a lot of persecution. Some of the instances of this you may have heard of, like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. That's a big part of it. Of course, this establishment of Fort Caroline happens before all of that, so that hasn't quite happened yet. So before the really bloody phase of the French Wars of Religion and sort of dealing with the Huguenots happens, there's this experimental idea that comes out from one of the Huguenot leaders. It's a guy named Hugh de Coligny, and that's spelled C-O-L-I-G-N-Y. Let's see if I got a picture of him. I think I got a picture of old Hugh here. Maybe I do. Well, there's that. No, we go straight to John Ribaut. So anyway, this one of the big guys in the Huguenots, and he's actually, even though he's serving a Catholic king, he's still welcome at court. He just kind of has to keep his religion kind of tamped down a little bit. His name's Gaspard de Coligny, and he's France's admiral at that time. And he's a Huguenot himself. And he has a plan to establish a new colony, a new French colony in this new continent of North America, and to try and do it sort of between where the British are claiming and where the Spanish are claiming down south in Florida and the Caribbean. And so he's thinking this is a great way for him and some of his Huguenot buddies to get rich. You know, maybe they'll be able to make something over in Florida, disrupt the Spanish. That's a big thing, because the Spanish and French are not big buddies right now, because the Spanish are, of course, devoutly Catholic. France is starting to kind of waver a little bit on that. And it also, the way he sells it to the king is he's like, look, I'll take all these Huguenots and they'll be out of your hair. So the king helped sponsor this expedition, and Coligny puts an expedition under the charge of Jean Ribaut over to the New World. Now, of course, he tried this. There's actually an expedition before the one where they go to Florida. He tries to send a group over to Brazil and get them settled over there. That one doesn't work out. That's in 1555. But the Florida trip went a little bit better. So in 1562, a fleet of French ships set out, and they arrive at the mouth of the St. Johns River. Let's see if we can get a map going here. This is a nice, pretty map to use. So Jean Ribaut, 1562, comes on over with his group of Huguenots, and they land near the mouth of what's now the St. Johns River. And they make this landing on April 30th of 1562. So the next day, of course, is the beginning of May. So they decide to name it the River of May. They plant a great big stone near the mouth of the St. John's. We're going to see that stone a little bit later. We don't actually know what happened to the real one, but it does get drawn by a later French Huguenot expedition. So we'll show that here in just a minute. Ribaut then sails northwards towards Port Royal, which is up here around Santa Elena. There we go. And you can see there we've got Regalis. That's Port Royal right here. Okay, and so they sail up there to Port Royal and they establish a garrison there, which is again essentially just a small military outpost. But then disaster strikes. Fire destroys a lot of their food and supplies, and there's a mutiny. Some of the expedition members actually decide that they would like to return to France in a small boat, not one of the bigger ones that's made for this kind of voyage. And if you want to use Narvaez's experiences as any sort of a yardstick, you can imagine it's just as bad for those guys as it was for Narvaez's expedition. They end up getting out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and they are becalmed. Meaning that they're not able to get any sort of favorable current or winds to move them forward, and they almost get to the point of having to resort to cannibalism when an English ship picks them up and takes them back to England. But of course, that ends up alerting all of Europe to the fact that the French are up to something in North America in an area that's being claimed by Spain. Meanwhile, Ribault himself ends up going back to France with a small group using one of the bigger ships. And at that point, civil war is still underway. We haven't even gotten to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre yet. So, I mean, we're still ramping up to that. And it's already bad enough that Ribault feels like he can't even stay in France. So Ribault ends up going out of the picture for a while. He hangs out in Britain for a few years and writes his memoirs. Okay? And so Colony, the royal favorite, is not really able to sponsor another voyage at this point. But by the next year, things have calmed down a little bit. So let's see, when does he get back over? 1563 or so. The Huguenot leader guy, Colony, is able to get another expedition going. But he puts somebody new in charge this time because Ribault's still out of the picture. He's over in England writing his memoirs. He gets this new guy named René Goulain de Laudonnière. Which is always fun to try to spell. And here he is. Let's see, I've got a picture of him. There he is. René Goulain de Laudonnière. I love speaking in French. It's almost like you can speak in English, but you got to pretend like you have a lump of peanut butter on the roof of your mouth. So anyway, Laudonnière is given the task of going over and making a second attempt to establish some kind of outpost for the Huguenots over in Spanish Florida, in the vicinity of that original spot there near the River of May. So April 22nd, 1564, Laudonnière sets out for Florida with 300 men and 4 women, and they arrive at the mouth of the St. Johns River, the River of May. And this time they decide to stay in Florida. They give up Port Royal because by the way, I forgot to mention, in the meantime, the Spanish figured out what was going on up at Port Royal and they went and destroyed everything up there. The French knew about this, so they thought, okay, we got to go to a different spot. So they decide to go to the mouth of the St. Johns River and they establish a fort, which they call Fort Caroline. Which, even though it sounds like a female name, in French, it's actually meant to honor the monarch at that time, which was King Charles in France. So even though it's Caroline, it's meant to be a derivative of the name Charles. At first, things are going pretty well in the new establishment there. So here they are up here at Fort Caroline, right here just up the River of May. At first, it's going pretty well. By the way, the Native Americans, when they find them, they show Ribault's monument. And there's a guy who's along with the expedition, Jacques Lemoyne de Morges, or something like that. Jacques Lemoyne, I know that part at least. And he goes along, and he's actually an artist and map maker who goes in and does lots of sketches on this trip. And it's wonderful because the Lemoyne sketches, which are later engraved by a guy named Theodore de Bry, these are some of the very first depictions of Native Americans in Florida by Europeans. And it's some of the very first pictures that we have of some of the wildlife, the flora and fauna, and some of the, it gives us an idea of some of the establishments that they have over there in the New World. Now, you can tell pretty quickly looking at these that they take a lot of artistic license with some of these things. And you know, these Native Americans sometimes adopt very sort of stylized stances. But again, this is a European trained artist. That's what he's going to do. So we have a number of these. If you're interested in the de Bry engravings, this is what this is what Jacques Lemoyne made Fort Caroline look like. You can see they've got a little moat going on here, some walls, some defenses, and they're telling you a little bit about the directions, how each way faces, and that sort of thing. Let's see if I've got any other Lemoyne ones here. Oh, and there's the National Memorial. There's nothing left of Fort Caroline, and they're not even exactly sure that it was right at the spot that they've got this memorial. But that didn't stop them from putting up a memorial in the 20th century. So we do have a memorial in the vicinity of Jacksonville for Fort Caroline. That's right there. Let's see. Okay. And so while the expedition is sort of starting to kind of get its feet there and kind of establish some buildings, get Fort Caroline going, meanwhile, Jacques Lemoyne is going around and observing all these Native Americans and stuff and really putting out some fantastic sketches that eventually make it into the hands of the engraver Theodore de Bride. And by the way, if you look at the bottom of your screen and you see these citations for all of these, you can type this into your web browser and it'll take you exactly to where on floridamemory.com where exactly we have these things. So if you're interested in getting that, you can. Okay, so, oops, I jumped ahead a little bit too far there. So at first things are going along pretty well, but then the colonists start to get a little restless. Some of them were really thinking that this would be a good opportunity to prey on Spanish shipping that was going right past Florida, headed back to Spain. And some of them decide that they really don't want to be part of this French Huguenot colony anymore, whether it's because they were actually Catholic sympathizers and they were tired of the Huguenot leadership, not exactly sure. But to suffice it to say that some of these guys decide to strike out on their own and just be French privateers, and they end up being stopped by the Spanish Navy on a couple of cases, and because of that, the Spanish realize that the French are once again up to something on the Atlantic seaboard, the coast of Spanish Florida, and so that's problematic. Now, right before the colony was about to sort of fold, this French Huguenot colony was about to fold, there were a lot of folks who were starting to despair of this colony ever being able to really make. And not to make matters worse, Laudonnière, in 1565, his health got really bad, and so the whole thing was about to fold. And then all of a sudden, here comes John Ribaut, who had finally finished his memoirs over in England, and he came over with 7 ships, 500 men, and 70 women. And by this time, it was already quite clear that the Spanish had learned that the French were up to something on the Florida coast. And so Ribaut says to Laudonnière, we really got to fortify Fort Caroline and get ready for the worst. Back in Spain, King Philip II is essentially saying, no way. There's no way that we can permit this to happen. And so he taps a dude named Pedro Menendez de Aviles to lead an expedition to go and expel these Lutheran heretics from Florida. So that catches us back up to where we were earlier. This is Pedro Menendez de Aviles. He's an interesting guy, kind of, this is still sort of the age of chivalry. And he's got some interesting stuff about him. Not only, he had spent a lot of time prior to this expedition chasing pirates off the coast of Spain. And at one point, he even rescued a bride and her bridesmaids who were sailing on their way to a wedding. And they had been taken over by pirates. And so he had this great story that I'm sure got told around lots and lots of campfires and in lots of pubs and things, or whatever you would call the equivalent of that in 16th century Spain, where he had gone and saved these women from an uncertain fate. Anyway, so he gets tapped by King Philip II to go and deal with this French Huguenot problem. June 20th, 1565, Menendez sails for Florida from Cadiz. Storms cause him a little bit of a delay, as they always seem to be doing at this time. They make a brief call at San Juan, Puerto Rico, and then head north to face the French. August 28, 1565, Menendez sights land just off the coast of what we now know to be St. Augustine. And he ends up naming that place St. Augustine because he finds it on the feast day of St. Augustine. The Spanish love to name things after the feast days of saints. So that's how we end up with a lot of these names that we have that have saints involved with them, and names of Catholic holidays and stuff like that. Before he lands, however, he doesn't actually land at St. Augustine right away. He actually goes up to the River of May because that's where, that's where the French are reputed to have their little fort. And he sights 4 French ships at anchor in the mouth of the St. Johns River. And the ships actually get close enough that the sailors are reputed to have been able to shout at each other. And the Spanish soldiers shouted out to the French soldiers who were aboard Jean Ribault's ships there in the River of May that they were going to burn all of these Lutheran heretics at the stake. And so the stage was really set for a big blow up here. And anyway, so Menendez lands at St. Augustine and starts establishing a home base right there. And he realizes that the French actually have more men than him at this point, and it looks like they may even have faster ships. So he's going to have to be kind of wily in dealing with the French at this point. Sorry, I've got Mayport on the brain because somebody asked a question about that. Now I want Mayport shrimp. Man. Anyway. So Menendez hatches a plan. He's thinking, all right, here we are. The French, they're up here. Here's where he sights the French vessels right up here. St. Augustine is up here just a little bit north of Cape Canaveral in this area. He's thinking that the French are going to come down and they're going to try and attack St. Augustine down here, which he's right about that, by the way. And he's thinking, in order for them to face us and do that, they're probably going to leave Fort Caroline pretty unguarded. And so he starts thinking, what if I were to go over land instead and attack Fort Caroline instead of facing the naval group down here and kind of rolling the dice about whether my ships are going to be good enough or not. And so that's exactly what he does. As a great storm is approaching the whole part of North Florida right here, Menendez de Aviles goes overland with his expedition and goes up here to Fort Caroline, which is not very well defended because all those soldiers, they think that they're on their way to go and face Menendez down here at St. Augustine going by sea. And so Menendez is able to actually take Fort Caroline. There's only about 130 or so defenders. Ends up killing most of those defenders and spares the women and children and a few other spare individuals. And there were still some French ships out here. Remember that Ribault had brought over 7 ships total. And then there were still some boats left over from when Laudonnière had come over. And there's still 3 ships here. And Menendez makes a deal with those ships. He says, look, guys, I'm going to let you have safe conduct back over to France if you'll take these women and children off my hands. Remember, chivalrous guy, right? So he's like, you take these women and children back, and I'll let your 3 ships go back. And I won't molest you guys while you're heading back over to France. Well, chivalry goes both ways. Because Jean Ribault's son was actually captaining one of those ships. And he said, nope, I would rather defend the honor of my king. And so Menendez is like, all right, well, I got some cannons here. We'll see what you think about that after I start shooting holes in your ships. And he actually shoots the ship with one of his cannons there and actually blows a hole in one of the ships, the one that Ribault's son is captaining, and it sinks. At that point, the other 2 ships, they realize that they've got a real problem here because all of Menendez's guys are right here at Fort Caroline. Their guys are already off, way too far away to help. And so they're like, man, we better cut our losses and go. So those other 2 ships that were here, they actually head off towards France, and they don't even take the women and children with them. It's kind of a sortie, so to speak. So kind of a weird moment there. So Menendez has taken Fort Caroline, and man, look at the time. I'm going to try and run through this very quickly. My last page of notes. So we will finish pretty close here to the end of time. My apologies for kind of running it right here to the end. But Menendez renames Fort Caroline Fort San Mateo and leaves a garrison there and starts heading back to St. Augustine, which was his home base, fully expecting that he might actually meet the French Armada that had gone down there to try and deal with him at the same time he was heading up to Fort Caroline. However, he finds out that the French armada that was supposed to be attacking him at St. Augustine had unfortunately run into a storm. Are you beginning to sense a pattern here? Don't try and do anything in hurricane season in the 16th century, or 17th for that matter, off the coast of Florida. Anyway, the French ships that had gone down to attack Menendez, they all were lost in a storm. And so they actually end up getting shipwrecked down here closer to Cape Canaveral. But they still felt that it was very important that Menendez be dealt with if Fort Caroline was to have any chance of surviving. They had no idea that Fort Caroline was already was already messed up. And so they start approaching from the south with the intent of making a land-based battle against Menendez at St. Augustine. So Menendez goes out and meets these guys. Their numbers were somewhat decimated, and so the French, they've lost a lot of their supplies, a lot of their weapons, and so when Menendez confronts them, their only option is to really throw themselves on his mercy. And what ends up happening, make a long story short, is Menendez spares a few of the Catholics, but everybody else, all the other soldiers, he essentially puts to the sword. And that act, that deed, is actually memorialized, you could say, in the name of that area, because you probably, if you've been over that way, you've probably heard of the Matanzas River or the Matanzas Inlet, or there was actually a small community over in that area just to the south of St. Augustine, about 11-15 miles south of St. Augustine, called Matanzas. That literally means the slaughters in Spanish, because literally hundreds of French soldiers, including Jean Ribault, were killed by Menendez and his men, executed right there. So no mercy really shown there, other than the ones who professed the Catholic faith. The French did a retaliatory expedition in June of 1567 after that, and they did manage to destroy Fort San Mateo. Remember, that's the old Fort Caroline up here at the River of May, up here at the mouth of the St. Johns River. And they hanged a few Frenchmen and that sort of thing, but, hanged a few Spanish individuals who were garrisoning that fort. But they did not stick around, and that retaliatory expedition did not feel strong enough to do a frontal attack on St. Augustine. So essentially, by 1565, things have kind of quieted down. Spain had established a permanent toehold in North America. It certainly took long enough, because those four explorers, Narvaez and De Luna and Hernando Desoto and all these guys, Ponce de Leon, they all tried and failed. It finally took the threat of not just any interference from France, but Protestant interference from France. That finally forced them to throw enough supplies, enough money, enough guns, enough people against the problem to get a settlement to stick, just barely, in St. Augustine. It's a little bit of a half victory. Florida turns out not to have the riches that it was reputed to have, but as we've said several times, it had to be held because of its strategic importance. And for a while, the Spanish were able to hold St. Augustine unmolested. But that kind of brings us to where we're going to come in next week, because next week, when we get started, a whole new threat is going to emerge. And that threat is going to come in the 1580s. And it happens to be depicted in the oldest object that is held by the State Archives of Florida, which is a map that I'm showing you right here. And if you look at that flag right there on the front, I'll just leave it right there. That is the country that Spain is going to face next. That's going to be the next international rivalry that Florida is at the crossroads of. And so that's where we will leave it for today. Look at that, only 2 minutes over. My apologies for that. But let's take some questions. Let's see, can someone mute everyone hearing interference? Sorry, I should have, let's see, I think I've got the ability to mute up here. Let's see. Of course, that doesn't do us any good now, but what I will do in the future is I'll mute everybody when we get started next time. Okay, May River associated with May Point. I don't know the definitive answer right off of that, but it's quite possible. I would imagine so, but I don't know that for sure. And then someone asked about the book. Yes, the best book about that, let me grab that really fast. 10 seconds. I'll be right back if I've got, I think I know exactly where it is. Well, toot. I lie like a dog. I'm not able to put my hands on that book right at the moment. I may have taken it into the office yesterday. I briefly went into the state archives and took a couple of books with me. I think I may have had it with me at that time. What I will do, though, is I will get the citation for that book, and I'll have it ready when we meet next week. I can, if folks are really interested in having the title of that, what you can do is the person who wanted that, if you will email me at joshua.goodman@dos.myflorida.com, and I'm going to type that out right here so that you'll have it. And all of you are welcome to send emails with questions. If we don't get it, your questions answered in this session, you're certainly willing to, certainly able to ask questions at any time about this or any other questions about the state archives. But if you will, send me an email to that address, and that'll give me some time to go and look that book up, and I'll be glad to share that. I'll also have the title ready for our next meeting. It's a wonderful book. It's called America, and then it's got a subtitle there, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he's a British historian, and he does an amazing job. He writes very approachably about this issue. Yes, you may email me about this or anything else. Okay, are you familiar with E.E. Calloway? Not right offhand, but pop me an email with your question regarding Mr. Calloway or Ms. Calloway, and we'll take a look at it. Any other questions about our material today?
Can I say something for a minute? We've been having a lot of interference. There were a couple of people, most people were muted. There were one or two unmuted, but I think some of the interference is maybe your connection, Josh. So when everybody else goes off before you end, will you stay on so I can talk to you for a minute about that?
Okay.
Okay, thanks very
Okay.
much.
Yeah, I definitely, there's something going on there because your video feeds are fine, but there's definitely some scrambling in the audio.
Yeah.
I really like the presentation. It's just really, like she had said, it's just really hard to hear. You're going in and out a lot, but I'm enjoying it. I just wish I could hear you more without the muffle, muffle, muffle.
I was just thinking, could it be do you have your note papers next to your keyboard or something? Because it got totally silent when you were out of the room. So, I don't know.
I think people aren't, I think there are some people that aren't muted. I conducted a class the other day for for services, and some people were not muted, and you just be shocked how a little noise when it's not muted goes all haywire on a computer.
Right.
It's just weird how it just amplifies it. I don't understand why, but it makes it sound like there's 10 people in the room. There's one person, but it makes it sound like 10. And I don't know the mechanics behind it because I'm not a computer person, but I have noticed that.
Let me try something really quick. I have just found the mute all function here. Let me try muting everybody real fast and see if it makes a difference. So make your comments in the written part. Okay, so everybody should be muted right now. So if that makes an improvement, type us a message in here and let's see if that's the culprit. If not, I don't think it should be my connection because your video is coming in fine. I won't be able to hear you. You'll have to type in. Okay. Well. Well. All right, I've unmuted everybody so that we can have a conversation once again. if there were parts that you that came through garbled and you just weren't able to get the audio, what we can do is if you have a question, feel free to email me, and I'll try and build a little review section into our first part of the program for next week. And that way, if you know, that way everybody will be up to speed when we get to when we get to the next step.
Okay.
And I may try, instead of relying on my wireless connection here, I may try doing a hard connection with a patch cable instead. That may, like I said, all the video looks good on my end, but
Josh, the video doesn't look good. There's blocks on the screen also. Some of the video is getting covered up, and it's been that way the whole time on mine. That's why I think it's your internet. I think, yeah. Some of it just went off, yeah.
Yeah, there's a block at the top of the screen that
Yeah.
means I can't see a lot of the titles on the slides.
Right, and it's been there the whole time on mine. I think it has something to do with the internet connection.
okay.
Maureen, that was the same on your stuff that we watched on the geology of the national parks. These little gray boxes would show up.
Really? I didn't know that. I wish somebody had told me.
They didn't. They usually weren't aggravating. They went away.
Well, we'll try some. I'll see if I can do some troubleshooting over the next little bit, because we certainly want to make this experience as good as possible. And if we need to, we can even go back and Maureen, maybe you and I can work out a way to do a second iteration of this. Just because I know it can be very annoying to have to listen to a webcast where it's cutting in and out. That's grating to the ears. So if we need to, I'm perfectly willing to do a second iteration of this if we need to set that up.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes,
We
thanks.
enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. See you next week.
Thank you, Josh.
my pleasure,
And
Josh.
hopefully from today to next week, we'll get this computer situation situated.
Thank
Have a
you.
good weekend, everybody. Y'all take it easy now. You hear?
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Josh.
Stay on for a minute, Josh, when everybody moves on. Talk to you for a minute.
Okay. Hey, Karen.
Hi, Josh. I'm going to stick around and listen too. I have to give a presentation next week, and I'm going to see if I can learn any tidbits on troubleshooting if this happens to me.
Yeah. I'm. The sound is already way better.
And maybe it's just because of the number of people, you think? I mean, that was one of the biggest presentations I've been to. Have you had more
Well,
than that?
the ones I did, was there a problem with the sound? Because mine had about as many people as Josh's.
No, I don't think the sound was as bad. I thought it was my connection, but if
No,
everybody's having
I think
problems-
it was yours, Josh, because I got everybody to mute except 2 people, and we could still hear yours, and then we could see those blocks on the screen. So I think
Right.
it might be the internet, but Hella has a connection at FSU that's a Zoom expert, and I'm going to talk to her about this and see if we can get this Zoom expert guy to see, if there's a way we can fix it.
Huh. Well, that's disappointing. Normally, I don't have any trouble with my wireless here at the house, but I wonder, ask them if it would be helpful to. I can connect rather than using the wireless connection. I can run a patch cable directly to my router and see if that helps.
So can you see that, Josh? See that big rectangle there at the top?
Yeah, we've had that the whole time.
That's been there the whole time.
Oh, bummer.
And then sometimes there was another 1 or 2 in the middle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
No idea. That's definitely not on this end. I don't know what's
But you
going
can't,
on.
yeah, so you can't see that big block.
No.
No, the
Yeah,
funny
I
thing, the one at the top, that is the same shape as the menu. That's the same shape as the menu that says mute, stop video, security,
Yeah.
participants, stuff like that. And so I'm wondering if it just kind of got stuck.
That could be. And it's supposed to come down and go back up, and it just didn't go back.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it did go back up, but it sounds like it froze for you guys. I wonder if, now when I did a program once for a genealogical society where something like that happened and the whole screen just kind of froze. It was doing right for me, but then it was freezing for them. And so what I had to do was stop the screen share, kind of like I just did.
Go back to
And
it
then-
now.
And then
start it
go
again?
back and
Yeah.
share again.
Yeah.
Do a new
Okay,
share.
let's do that and see what happens.
Yep. So here we go. A new share.
I don't, oh yeah, yeah, it's still there.
It's still there, yeah.
Huh. Really? Can you see me drawing all over the WASD
Yeah.
map?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
except the drawing doesn't, we can't see the drawing. It's like that thing is blocking it. We can't see drawing over it. The block is in the way.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, we can see the drawing on the lower part of the map, but
Yeah,
you
just
can't
not where the
go
block
up
is.
into the block. We can't see it.
Yeah.
I don't know, guys. That's the first time I've encountered that problem.
We're the lucky ones.
Us too, yeah.
Well, I wonder if maybe I need to do this on a work computer instead of doing it at home. I can. Let's see. I'm trying to think how I'll need to, it's got to be a computer that's got a microphone. I probably need to, anyway, we'll see if we can work something out to where we don't have this happen again, because I sure hate that. I know it's got to be annoying as all get out for the participants when the sound is coming in garbled like
Yeah,
that.
I could still get most of what you were saying, but it was garbled and it was a little annoying to listen to.
Right.
What-
I mean, 90% of it was fine, but there were other times when you really had to concentrate
Yeah.
to hear it.
And no, I think we want to, or at least I want to do whatever I can to overcome that.
Now your voice sounds fine. And when I practiced with you, when was it, yesterday or whenever we practiced, or Tuesday, it was
Right.
fine.
Yeah, the most I've had in a Zoom meeting before this was 15, and 15 we were fine. Didn't have any problems at all.
What did you have today, Maureen? You had like 40 or
45 at the most. Some people left, I think, maybe because they couldn't hear. And it was down to about 40. But I had that many in the national parks class, and we never had any problems.
I don't remember.
Probably this connection, may even be this computer. That's so strange. That's so strange. I wonder if it has anything to do with the with like using this drawing tool and PowerPoint, stuff like that. I purposely closed all other programs besides the ones that we needed for this.
I don't think so. 'cause
I don't think it's the drawing, because
I
it
don't
was
either.
happening from the beginning before you started drawing. When you were talking about the archives and your background and stuff at the very beginning.
Yeah.
So if you go back to the very first slide, I think before you started drawing, I think
The block was on there. Yeah.
it still has the block on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Going back through all of these, when you look at the drawings, it looks like a toddler has been hanging out with my PowerPoint presentation. I didn't realize it. I mean, it's one of those cases where you really had to be here, because none of this scribbling makes any sense whatsoever.
That's right. It's a good thing you're not scribbling on the originals.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is not permitted. But overall, this was a lot of fun. I'm sorry it kind of got there a little squished at the end. You know me, I find plenty of tangents to get off on along the way. I'm just pleased that it was no more than 2 minutes over.
It was very good. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Good.
And what,
Well,
are you going to be in work someday this week or early next week that you could try it from your work computer with me, and I'll see if the box is on there. We'll see how the sound is.
yes. And I bet you anything, if I were to close this program entirely and then come back into the room, I bet you it wouldn't even do that.
Right.
I bet you it's just a glitch of the program. And once that happened, I probably should have just said, all right, wait a minute, everybody. I'm going to drop out for a minute and come back in. Because I saw people doing that, thinking that it was their connection.
Yeah.
People were dropping. I admitted
Yeah,
probably
dropping out.
20 people in the room.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and a lot of times it would be the same person coming in and out thinking that they were trying to shake off some
Mhm.
flack, some interference. Now I'm beginning to wonder if maybe I should have done that.
Well,
and
I didn't
maybe
want to
that-
stop you and tell you. I was trying to.
Do you want to
privately-
test that now? Do you want to test it now?
Yeah,
and have
let's
Josh-
try that. Let's try that now and see. So I'm going to completely leave the room and then
Yeah.
ask to come back in.
Okay. Well, you're
So
the
you-
host. So you close the meeting and then open it back up again and then let us back in. Okay.
Or,
Oh,
or
that's
he-
right. I have
or
the.
he can
Wait a minute.
just switch the host back to you, Maureen. And then
Yeah.
Switch it back to me. That's right.
Yes.
Then we'll
Let
just
me-
stay here.
Okay, so participants, here's Maureen. Maureen, make host. I want to change the host to Maureen, yes.
Okay, I'm the host now. Okay.
Okay, so
All right.
now Josh, you can leave.
All right, I'm gonna leave and come back. Bye.
Bye. Okay. I don't see an email yet from the national conference.
Yeah, I've been watching too the whole time I was listening to Josh, so it probably won't come till tomorrow. So everybody's going to be practicing on
the
Friday.
weekend.
Yeah. And then it'll crash, right?
Mhm.
Oh, gosh. Well, at least I got the grant report done, so I can just focus on this whenever it comes through.
All right, I gotta admit him now. There he goes. Okay. All right, you're back.
All right, I'm here.
All right,
So let's try this. Why don't you stay the host?
Yeah.
I can still share my screen. I
You're
can still share my
garbling again.
screen.
yeah, your voice is garbled a
Voice
little
is
bit.
garbled again.
Yep. It's got to be my connection here.
And yeah, and the blue is still on there.
Yeah, the block is still there.
Yeah.
Man, okay. It's got to be this connection or this computer.
Yeah. That's
That
what I'm.
is a bummer.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, well, I've
I
learned
know what I gotta
something.
do.
I guess, Maureen, I need to practice with somebody before I do my presentation.
Yeah. You can
'Cause
practice
you've done
with
it
me,
before.
and I'll practice with you, like, a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we don't need to involve Josh in that, but
No, we don't. But Josh, when you're in work, either email me or call me and I will, and then we can set up a practice meeting and see how that works.
Okay. That sounds like a good plan, y'all. I'm so sorry that we had those technical issues, but I'm glad. I mean, people seem to be engaged and we had a good number.
yes, definitely.
So,
Yeah, I think most of them will come back, so that's good.
I think so.
good,
It was
Yeah.
good.
And I wonder
Good
if we could, if we send an email to say that we've, found a couple of things that seem to sort of be the culprit and we're going to get
Oh,
away
yeah,
from
I
that.
will. Yeah. I'll send that one, in the next week. I have everybody's email, so. Okay,
All
thank you
right.
so much. It was real interesting.
All right,
All right.
thanks.
See you guys next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Ending the meeting.